Hey, Justice Warriors, good morning. I'm finally doing a morning video. It's been a while. So, trying to get my schedule together, trying to keep myself together. Please hit that like button if you'd be so kind. And share, subscribe, ring your notification bell if you like to be notified when videos are being dropped or I'm going live. I've got some writing on my t-shirt. I'll just read it for you so you're not like, what the heck? We can change the world. Cool, right? And then there's the subliminal message here: work hard, stay humble. You know me and my subliminal messages, right? So I'm going to continue reading The Eyes of a Killer, Part 5. Um, and the whole title is In Cold Blood, The Eyes of a Killer, Part 5. So hats off to Truman Capote, right? That is an incredible body of work, and I highly recommend it if you haven't read it and seen both movies. The one that Beretta is in, the guy who played Beretta, he plays Perry, the mastermind of that awful quadruple homicide. I don't even like to say his name because then, you know, the anyway. Um, he was a great actor, but his at the end of his life, he kind of um, I don't know, reflected or repeated what was in that movie, and he started in that movie when he was like 17, I think. So, anyway, also Seymour Philip Hoffman or Seymour Hoffman Philip, he did the movie Capote, and that was just like probably 15 years ago, and he did an incredible job. That book, in case you don't know, in case you haven't seen me talking about it before, In Cold Blood, kind of changed, not kind of, it changed the way people wrote in English literature, for articles as well as books, because it started with newspaper articles. You know, Capote worked for the New Yorker magazine with his good friend Harper Lee, and then he went on site for 5 years to that town in um, Kansas. So, long story short, he fell in love with Perry. He watched Perry get executed. Perry was a very twisted individual and had been abused as a child and blah, 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 blah. Truman was a raging alcoholic and also an incredibly talented and bright individual. He grew up with Harper Lee, and she also worked at the New Yorker with him, and he convinced the New Yorker to keep extending his stay and to send her to be his secretary. So, like I said, long story short. Anyway, this article is written for airmail. I didn't really specify that yesterday. And forgive me, I do have a tendency to misenunciate words and especially names. So I try my best. So it's by Howard Blum or Bloom. I think it's Howard Blum. Um, and he dropped this on July 29th of this year. So I got through, I think, almost the first half of it yesterday with you guys. And let me see. Um, 1 second. Sorry about that. Is it gonna? It says unlocking article. Please wait. Sorry, I thought I already had it unlocked for you guys. So everything I say, even when I'm reading an article, is simply for the sake of conversation. It's all my opinion, hoping to open up a discussion, and I'm always trying to learn more and hoping that people find my video drops educational and heartwarming, maybe. I do try to just be myself, be authentic, and focus on other content creators that I feel like are really good at being themselves and being authentic. And I'm telling you, the longer you do this, I think the easier it is to get more comfortable talking to a camera, because it is a little bit awkward at first. Even if you're used to it, like with Zoom meetings, in Zoom meetings, it's live and you're interactive. So for me, it's actually harder when it's a pre recorded. But anyway, enough about me and my problems, right? Here we go. And I told you yesterday when I stopped, my stopping point was at this photograph of Caden Young. Can you see that? And he's the young man that passed away from an overdose. And I also want to clarify that there's two Caden Youngs that play football, I believe, for the University of Idaho. So the um, the lighter skinned one is younger and he's the quarterback, I think. It's really hard to follow. And of course, Google has all their wires crossed. So trying to uncross them is close to impossible. But this Caden Young is the young man who passed away at 22 years old over spring break in southwestern Washington state, just south of Olympia. I used to live in Olympia and I lived in Portland. I lived in Seattle. I lived all over the place on the West Coast. So this is all my old stomping ground. Um, so here we go. The This is a tough word. The penultimate day of Young's brief life began with a decision to leave the apartment in Centralia, Washington, where he was visiting a one-time Alpha Kappa Lambda fraternity brother, Christopher O'Flaherty. After O'Flaherty had gone off to work, Young decided he'd take an Uber to Tacoma. And Tacoma is historically very seedy. It was invented as a city for the red light district of Seattle. A lot of people don't realize that. That's why it's so seedy. And I'm not saying the whole thing is seedy. There's a lot that Tacoma has to offer, like anywhere else. And, there's parts of Seattle and even Olympia that are very seedy, and especially Portland, Oregon, as beautiful as all those cities are. Um, let's see. Young decided he'd take an Uber to Tacoma, where he would meet up with some friends who would drive him to Seattle. The next morning at nearly 1 a.m., O'Flaherty told me he got a call from Young saying he was at the Harborview Hospital in Seattle. I used to do a lot of 5150 assessments at Harborview. We called it, again, the zoo, Harbor Zoo. And it's kind of what Grey's Anatomy is modeled after. Anyway, lots of incidental stuff there. Pretty seedy place, big time. Harborview Hospital in Seattle and needed a lift home. Bro, what happened? O'Flaherty asked. Young, with a matter of factness that surprised his friend, recounted that he'd been partying that afternoon with friends in a room in a Seattle Holiday Inn and snorted some cocaine apparently laced with fentanyl. The next thing he knew, his face went white, then blue, then suddenly everything turned completely black. I was dead, bro, and how Young, apparently still dazed and bewildered by it all, summed things up to O'Flaherty. How frightening. An ambulance, however, had been summoned. Um, Naloxone was administered, and the next thing Young remembered was waking up in a bed in a hospital, alive. He was now being released, and he was hoping his old Alpha Cap brother would come and get him. So at 2 a.m., O'Flaherty made his way to the hospital. That's a long drive, you guys. That's at least 90 minutes from Centralia. So 3 hours, let's see, round trip. And to, like I said, a very seedy place. Um, so at 2 a.m., O'Flaherty made his way to the hospital and retrieved his buddy. On the ride back to Centralia, he grew concerned because his passenger seemed out of it, nodding off frequently. But they nevertheless stopped at a Jack in the Box to grab burgers, not Jack in the Box again. They keep getting dragged into this. Um, so let's see. But they are good, right? They're open like all the time. Young had roused from his fog long enough to announce in an emphatic voice that he was hungry. Um, Once back at O'Flaherty's apartment, though, Young immediately crashed on the futon in his friend's bedroom, and he was snoring something awful. Flattery playfully recorded the racket on his phone. He thought he'd have a good laugh over it in the morning, but when Flattery checked on his friend a bit later, there was a swirl of whitish vomit circulating Caden's mouth, and a frantic search for a pulse revealed nothing. When the medics arrived, it became official. Caden had suffered his second and final passing. It was all too common. Another young life ravaged by fentanyl, and within days, it might very well have become simply another tragic statistic in a national body count that is climbing toward pandemic proportions. But then the police made two arrests in connection with Young's death. Hurrying to room 214 of the Holiday Inn where Young had first overdosed, the police arrested Emma Bailey, 22, of Moscow, and Demetrius Robinson, 36, of Tacoma, just as they were apparently preparing to leave. They were each charged with one count of conspiracy to commit a violation of the Uniform Controlled Substance Act. That is, they had allegedly supplied the student with the fentanyl laced cocaine and held on $100,000 bail. Pleading not guilty but unable to post bail, they were shuffled off to the Lewis County Jail where they were to await their May 31st trial date. Or, I'm sorry, May 30th trial date. 2 months and 5 days behind bars. During the time, law enforcement investigators and the press kept digging. And what they unearthed grabbed the attention of the, how do we say this word? Preternaturally curious Koberger defense team. That's not a word I'm familiar with. Preternaturally curious. Wow. Cha-ching! 25 cents, right? Okay, Robinson, or D, as he was widely known in the college towns of both Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington, had quite a rap sheet. Extensive was the adjective the local paper used to describe it. Violent was the modifier, though, that leaped up in many people's minds. Among the eyebrow raising highlights, a 15-month prison sentence for a second degree assault in Pullman back in 2018, a second degree RAPE investigation 2 years later, and then in 2021, an arrest in Pullman for suspicion of possession of a controlled substance with intent to deliver, and for allegedly assaulting a companion when their alleged partnership went south. While the drug case had fallen apart because of legal concerns over an overly gung ho search of the hotel room, I'm going to read that again. While the drug case had fallen apart because of legal concerns over an overly gung ho search of a hotel room, the fourth degree assault and harassment charges stuck. And let me just add right here that Washington has some of the most liberal laws of our entire country. Not probably as liberal as Idaho, but they're also right next to each other. And Washington tends to be Democratic. Idaho, of course, not Democratic. But anyway, it's relevant. It all, basically in Washington state, you are free to be as crazy and dangerous as you want, as long as it's not due to a mental health problem. And then, if it is due to a mental health problem, you're free to be as crazy and dangerous as you want, as long as you're not putting your life or somebody else's life at risk. And I'm not exaggerating. I had a hard time doing those 5150s because by law, I often had to spring people, but I could usually connect with them to convince them that they needed to do a voluntary commitment rather than having the documentation to justify an involuntary commitment and stripping them of their civil rights for 72 hours because anyway, not to go off with that. I'm going to read it one more time. While the drug case had fallen apart because of legal concerns over an overly gung-ho search of a hotel room, the fourth degree assault and harassment charges stuck, and he served 151 days in jail. Also scattered about Robinson's sheet were 5 charges for driving with a suspended license, one of which landed him in jail for 5 days. There was an outstanding arrest warrant for another. So I'm reading you guys this just in case you haven't come across it, or even if you have come across it, I think it's just very relevant to review right now. As for Bailey, her record was more banal. DUI arrest this past February after she breezed through a red light in Pullman around 2 a.m. There's an amusing visual record of the aftermath police body cam video of an obviously inebriated yet indignant Emma trying with impressive sincerity to convince the bemused cop that she hasn't been out seriously drinking. Yeah, that girl has some confidence, and yeah, she totally like put her foot in her mouth and tripped herself up a bunch of times. Bailey's mother, Kimberly, though, told a more plaintive and complicated story about her daughter in two lengthy telephone conversations that were recorded by the Centralia detectives investigating the sale of the lethal fentanyl laced cocaine. As the mother told it, her daughter was an innocent Moscow High graduate who put in a disjointed year at the University of Idaho before hooking up with Robinson, 14 years her senior, a charmer with his cornrows and tough guy menace. And with a tumultuous 5 year love story, their romance and what a tumultuous 5 year love story their romance has been. Okay. Bailey, her mother, said has allegedly been living in fear of Robinson's violent mood swings and hair raising threats of what will happen to her family if she ever leaves him. There have been times, in fact, when Kimberly and her ex husband have rushed to their daughter's rescue after getting a teary distress call. They'd drive for hours and then covertly ferry her off while Robinson was sleeping the afternoon away. But each time Bailey would run back to Robinson. Was it love? Was it fear? Bailey's mom worried to the police as if Emma's friends who followed her Instagram account showing her living a high flying life in hotel suites in Vegas and Cancun, that Robinson was turning her out. And there was more. When the cops dug deeper, they grew to suspect that the couple were very possibly dealing drugs they'd scored in Seattle to the local colleges in Pullman and Moscow. In fact, they discovered that the detectives' incident report flatly stated there were investigations in other jurisdictions for Emma and Demetrius for narcotics trafficking. O'Flaherty told the cops that he'd first met Bailey when she'd come to the Alpha Lambda Kappa parties to see if the brothers were interested in scoring some coke. And this is a very, very common thing nationwide in frat houses for anyone who is not familiar with that. I first, out of high school, went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and that school was highly dominated by the Greek life. I didn't get involved. I did not get involved. I think I went to one frat party that I remember and I stayed on the front porch. I was not putting my toe in the door because this was in the mid 80s and, you know, you didn't put yourself in a frat house. I mean, I didn't even like being on the front porch. I was talking to my friend and I was only there briefly. And like I said, that was the only time. Um, although I won't go into it. You know, I was a little boy crazy, and yeah, the president of that fraternity was pretty fine. And he was there, so maybe that's why I left because I was pretty shy too. Believe it or not. I still am, believe it or not. A lot of people who know me are surprised to find that out. But anyway. Let's see. Enough about me. Let's get on with this. About Coke. I'm going to read it again because I interrupted myself. O'Flaherty told the cops that he'd first met Bailey when she'd come to the Alpha Lambda Kappa parties to see if the brothers were interested in scoring some coke. But he also learned firsthand that she was merely the enticing go between. We've heard this again and again. Robinson was the iron fisted closer. I think that excerpt from this article has been widely publicized in the media and YouTube. He'd hand over the product and give you the look that made sure you paid. When I spoke with O'Flaherty, he gave me a very similar account of the couple's activities. And when I ran this scenario by a handful of students and ex students in Moscow and Pullman who'd confided that they knew Bailey and Robinson, time after time I got pretty much a uniform response. The couple did a lively business dealing drugs along Greek Row. Big money, you guys. Big money. And then there's people above them that are making even bigger money. It's a thing. We won't call it anything other than dealing, right? We're just going to stick with that simplicity. Um, but, Greek Row is a place with money, too. Neither Bailey nor Robinson responded to any of the messages, although at one point Bailey accepted the $5.25 I'd put in her account so she could email me over the carefully managed prison internet, and she acknowledged my inquiries to her lawyer. A friend, however, acting on their instructions, ultimately sent me a text, and we talked by phone. Tanner Aspire announced that he was Dee's good buddy and, in fact, was planning to go into business with him. You're going to admit that to a reporter? Okay, then. That got my attention. What business? I asked guardedly. Fish farming, Tanner explained. They were going to open a business to farm trout in Colorado. We'll be able to sell them over the entire Midwest. Colorado is a good place for fish farm, I asked without any real interest. I just wanted to keep him talking. Still, my question seemed to throw him. There was a long silence, and at last he suggested thoughtfully, maybe Montana does make better sense. But all this airy business talk was just a prelude to the message he wanted to deliver. Both Emma and Dee want you to know that they'd never deal drugs, and they never sold any cocaine to Caden, Aspire said, adding, the worst you can say is that Dee has an anger management problem, but Dee is getting it under control. I dutifully took it all down, but I still had one question. What's Emma's role going to be in the fish farm? It's a real love story, Aspire assured me, while at the same time deftly avoiding the question. Where Dee goes, Emma goes. And the couple did, in fact, go off together. So let me interject right here that when you're dealing, you have to launder your cash. And I just think that's very relevant to interject right there. You have to have a business, a legit business that you can launder your cash. So, and that's usually where people get busted because uh, that's traceable. Follow the money, right? Okay, and the couple did in fact go off together just 5 days before the trial for supplying the lethal cocaine. Okay, just 5 days before the trial for supplying the lethal cocaine was to begin, a judge dismissed the case. Reading that one a second time because I screwed it up. Just 5 days before the trial for supplying the lethal cocaine was to begin, a judge dismissed the case. I don't know if this is judge or a different judge. Um, Probably a judge in Washington, but I know that they were being held over there in Moscow, so I'm a little confused. Let's see. Their legal aid lawyer had zeroed in on a technicality, but it was clearly a very consequential one. The question of prosecutorial jurisdiction, what I was just talking about. Apparently, they'd been scheduled to be tried in the county where the death had occurred rather than where the cocaine had been originally ingested. But their good fortune might be short lived. The judge had dismissed the case without prejudice. That means that it can be refiled in the same court of law if the authorities draft a new and more carefully drawn indictment. Is one in the works? All a fuming Centralia detective who'd been involved in the case from the morning he'd found Young's inert body would say is, we're not going to let this case disappear. Yeah, that'd be a bad day at work, finding a kid like that. But it's not that uncommon out there. Western Washington is been hitting the skids as far as I'm concerned the last decade and a half with the legalization of recreational marijuana and the homelessness factor through the sky and prices of everything have just skyrocketed. It's insane out there. And I'm just glad we moved back to Ohio just in the nick of time, like literally months before the legalization of recreational marijuana. And in my opinion, that's not good for people. I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't judge anybody. I just know it would not have been good for me in my how many years now? Since 1989. So almost 35 years of recovery. Um, let's see. And he's not alone. The case hasn't disappeared from the thoughts of the Koberger defense team either. It is a touchstone, according to the people familiar with their inquiries. That has the team digging deep into the possibility of narcotics trafficking along Greek Row in Moscow and wondering whether these furtive activities might have played a part in the Red Rums. What, if anything, they've uncovered is wrapped up tight by the iron bands of the gag order, but now having caught the scent, I head off on my own. I want to know what they want to know. The overview offered by the Seattle DEA field office is a tale of cutthroat international intrigue, a pipeline that runs from China, where the fentanyl precursor chemicals are produced, to the sinister, I'm going to hack this one up, Sinaloa, and Jalisco cartels in Mexico. We weren't going to use that word, which manufacture the drugs and then smuggle the too often lethal product to their distribution networks in northwestern urban hubs such as Seattle and Spokane. Then, with the eager help of a freelance army of small time distributors, that's very well worded. That's why I like this journalist. I'm going to read that again just because that cracks me up. Then, with the eager help of a freelance army of small time distributors, the tentacles of the octopus reach into the seemingly wholesome all American counties and college towns stretching across the great outdoors. That's the view from 1,000 feet. But Sheriff Brett Myers, head of the Quad City Drug Task Force. Brett Myers, you guys, write that name down if you're taking notes. Sheriff Brett Myers. Another Brett, and head of the Quad City Drug Task Force, a multi jurisdictional team propped up in part by federal money, whose territory includes the university towns of Moscow and Pullman, along with the Lewis Clark State College in Lewiston, Idaho, offers a ground level account, and it's enough to give anyone whose kid is heading off to college in the area the willies. Matter of factly, the sheriff shares that his task force is working with college kids in the local schools whom they've caught dealing MDMA and cocaine. MDMA, I believe, is the Molly, right? The ecstasy, the rave drug of choice. Um, the local schools whom they've caught dealing MDMA and cocaine, flipping them and using the students to go after the big local dealers. And once the scared, witless college kids have helped his team ID the foot soldiers, we go up the ladder to get the people tied to the cartels in the cities. Sounds pretty dangerous for the kids, I suggested. It could be. Yeah, it is. Um, there are some seriously tough guys running this business. Yeah, you think like understatement of the century? Full of resolve, though, he adds, but we're game to do that every day of the week. And with that disconcerting prelude, I steer the conversation to the red rums of the four University of Idaho students. The sheriff concedes that while it's a small local law enforcement community, he's not specifically involved in the investigation and therefore not constrained by the gag order. So, there are a lot of unanswered questions, he acknowledges. Pressed further, he candidly goes on, could it have been a drug related case? I can't rule it out. It's not improbable. From what I know, that answer a lot of questions. Oh, those could be my words exactly. But this is all abstraction and moving on from the sheriff. And let me just say that that was in quotes. That's not Howard Blum's words. That is um, Sheriff Brett Meyer's words. I'm going to read that paragraph one more time. Could it have been a drug related case? I can't rule it out. It's not improbable. From what I know, that would answer a lot of questions. That's all in quotes from Brett Meyer, Sheriff Brett Meyer, the Drug Task Force commander. But this is all abstraction, and moving on from the sheriff, my search team turns to a concrete inquiry. Did any of the victims know Bailey and Robinson? And my inquiries conclude with an unqualified maybe. Good place to pause. Ashlyn Couch, then a University of Idaho senior, was an original signer of the lease on the King Road house with the others, but she never moved in. We've all heard that name, right? Nevertheless, she remained a friend as well as a sorority sister of several of the residents, and according to some reports, she would visit from time to time. Couch would Couch also follows Bailey on Instagram, which could mean something or nothing. But it does lead to another question. Did Bailey know Koberger? And this query has persuaded investigators associated with the defense to revisit Brian Koberger's first day in Moscow. Church versus state. If it hadn't been for his father, Koberger might not have been invited to the pool party. Michael Koberger had dutifully made the cross country road trip from the family home in the Poconos with his son last summer to Pullman as Brian prepared to start graduate school. It was, he might very well have felt, a gesture sparked by paternal concern. After all, Michael certainly knew only too well how difficult and mercurial his son's moods could run, and he wanted to help Brian settle into his new life as a graduate student at Washington State University on the other side of the country, the young man's first extended trip away from home. He could also have been suffering a father's guilt over the rough road his son's life had traveled. Heroin addiction, or a torrent of psychological problems, as well as the hard scrabble experience of being pulled along through the family's two bankruptcies. Now that things were seemingly back on track, Michael wanted to do what he could to make amends. And so when Michael was crossing the parking lot of the apartment complex of Northeast Valley Road, a stone's throw from the WSU campus, he spotted his son's new next door neighbor, Christian Martinez. He hurried over to him. He wanted the burly married military veteran's help. Michael confided that his son had a hard time making friends. He was shy. Could Martinez maybe look out for him? That chance encounter led Martinez to invite his new neighbor to a pool party on July 9th at the Grove, a clapboard complex of buildings filled with college kids, mostly University of Idaho students, a 15-minute or so drive across the state line in Moscow. Thanks. I have to run and get trunks, Koberger texted back. And so while Zach, DJ Grape Vinyl Cartwright, a muscular PhD in food science with the countenance of an Aztec chieftain and a jet black man bun manned the turntables, Koberger in his new trunks. I thought he meant he had to go get trunks, like, because he was moving, like suitcase types of trunks. Anyway, funny. In his new trunks, perched at the shallow end of the large pool, Bad Bunny wailed from the speakers, imploring party, 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 party. Chicken and steak were being grilled to make tacos. There was beer, wine, and tequila. The sun was blinding. There must have been 100 or more college kids on the deck, surrounding the two large ovals that formed the pristine blue pool. And just down the hill from the housing complex, close enough for Bad Bunny to come rattling through its windows, was the Moscow police headquarters. Moscow, sorry, I misenunciated that. Taking a seat next to Koberger was Bathith's, I cannot say his name, Salamanjan, Basseth Salamanjan, a laid-back, darkly handsome, off and on WSU undergraduate who is friends with Martinez and Cartwright. He and Koberger got to talking, and while the details of the conversation have long been forgotten, Salamanjan, I'll just leave it at that. Sorry if I'm messing it up. Vividly remembers how the dude would talk, chin up, straight into my face. We were just shooting shit, he says, but he was definitely one serious dude. Nice enough, though. Then Solomon John stood up and went off to dance. So Koberger, perhaps not wanting to be a wallflower at the party, was gathering steam, went over to talk to the DJ. He was asking me about my speakers, all kinds of technical stuff, Cartwright remembers. But he had this way about him. You know, those people who don't understand personal space? He was one of them. I've had one of my commenters insist that she thinks he's on the spectrum. I'm not qualified to discern that, and I have argued with that person, but I definitely see their point. So, but the reason that I argue with that person is because I don't want that to have a stigma attached to it to the people that are on the spectrum. Like, if he is guilty, then that makes people on the spectrum look bad. Like, that's being on the spectrum doesn't make a person dangerous by any means, in my opinion. Um, it just makes it hard for them to interact with others. It makes them awkward. And it also, let me add, would make them an easy target to pin something on, in my humble opinion. So here we go. You know those people who don't understand personal space? He was one of them. He'd get real close. It was off putting. Finally, Cartwright told his new acquaintance, I'm DJing, man. I'll catch you later. With that, Koberger returned to the shallow end of the pool, and before too long, Solomon John returned too. And he witnessed two events that, in their pregnant way, are provocative footnotes to all that would happen in Moscow just a few months later. He watched as Koberger abruptly jumped up without warning and approached a girl in a black thong bikini with pink hair and a complex tattoo design on her left thigh. Then Koberger, after only a brief conversation, asked her for her phone number, and he got it. Does not sound like an insult to me at all. Not at all. Um, Interesting, huh? Next, as if a man on a mission, he turned to the pink haired woman's friend, also in a black two piece, and asked for her number too. And he succeeded once again. Now that's pretty funny. Um, Again, lack of social skills, possibly, or I won't judge. I'll just continue. Only after that, perhaps feeling he'd accomplished all he'd set out to do, more in fact, Brian quickly shuffled off while the party was just hitting a groove. He said no goodbyes. Did he ever call the two women? They insist he didn't, at least not long enough to speak to them. As it happens, both women received several hang up calls in the aftermath of the party, but neither of them ever had any thoughts about who the culprit might have been until Koberger's arrest. And by then, the FBI was inquiring into what went on at the pool party. The agents commandeered a room at the Red Brick Lightly Student Services building adjunct to the main WSU campus, and with a professional politeness that impressed the students, began interviewing anyone who knew Koberger. In the process, they inquired if anyone had any photos or even a video from the July 9th pool party. A few were produced. It was not an extensive record of the festivities, more a haphazard collection of snapshots and at least one brief, somewhat random video. The agents were searching for Goncalves, Mogan, Kernodle, or Chapin. They could not find them, which means that they weren't at the Grove pool party. Wouldn't say it means that. I wonder if that's misworded. They could not find them, which means that they weren't at the Grove pool party. It doesn't necessarily mean that, right? Or they simply didn't appear in the photos that were taken that day. Or maybe they just weren't in the handful that were shared with the Bureau. But what if the FBI's review done last November in the early stages of the investigation was too narrow? What if they'd scrutinized the pictures and the video and had ignored the possible presence of another guest whose appearance could put a new spin on what happened at the house on King Road? What if Emma Bailey had been at the pool party? If she had been, then she might very well have also been approached by a Koberger on the make. And if, as the police allege, she was in the habit of dealing recreational drugs, it might have been a connection a one-time heroin addict like Koberger would have relished. Also could be one that he would avoid like the plague, I gotta add, as someone in recovery myself. It might have been a connection that, unlike his approaches to the other two female partygoers, could have had some longevity. In fact, he might have even visited Bailey from time to time at her home in Moscow, which, as it happens, was tucked into the very end of a cul-de-sac a minute or so away from the slaughterhouse by car, which would put it very much within the same incriminating cell tower radius as the scene of the crime on King Road. And this becomes an even more tantalizing hypothesis because of an explosive motion the defense submitted earlier this week. Koberger has an alibi. Evidence corroborating Mr. Koberger being at a location other than the King Road address will be disclosed, Ann Taylor wrote in the court filing. Only with a dramatic flair, she coyly did not release any further details. Presumably, all will be disclosed at the trial. But for now, the defense's motion makes one provocative question very relevant. So was Emma at the party? The partay. I talked to 7 people who had been there, and the responses I got, all shared after a good deal of thought, ran the gamut of "I think she was" to "she might have been." But no one said definitively she was, and no one definitively said she wasn't. In short, there remains enough for the defense to sink its teeth into. And it offers the promise of a narrative that can be presented to a jury as a hypothetical alternative to the version presented by the prosecution. And in the end, with the dark cloud of the death penalty hovering portentously over the proceedings, that's what it will come down to, convincing a jury. The, the jurors will decide whether the state has presented the sort of airtight case that will justify its taking one more life in retribution for the 4 that were already extinguished. In a heartland community such as Moscow, I had expected that I'm going to hack up this word, predilection, sorry, for Old Testament, eye for eye justice would rule. The prosecution, despite the many deficiencies in its storyline, will nevertheless not need to work too hard to spin a narrative that will catapult Koberger into the execution chamber. But it takes just a conversation with Pastor Doug Wilson. We all know who that is, right? And his son and his grandson. The head of the town's ultra-conservative Christ Church to convince me that I am wrong. The Kirkers, as the parishioners are commonly known, are increasingly a dominating presence in Moscow. Already 2,000 or so strong. Wow, that's huge. The school is just about 11,000, and the community, I think, is about 13,000. So that's like almost 10% of the entire population of Moscow. I didn't know it was that big. I knew it was big. Perhaps nearly half of the town's non-university affiliated jury pool. Oh my goodness. They control a bookstore and coffee shop on Main Street, as well as 2 separate real estate offices and their own college. Only here's one thing. The church, as personified by Wilson, is in a state of war with the town authorities, including the police department, whose investigation had built the case against Koberger. Last Christmas, just before Koberger's arrest, Wilson shared his raw feelings about the town fathers in one of his weekly um, encyclicals that he sent to his flock. Our local city government, law enforcement included, is a nest of incompetence and corruption, he told the church members, and rather than turning the other cheek, he went on with measured force. If the additional scrutiny over the murder cases is part of what brings a much needed house cleaning, then we should be grateful for that, but without any unlawful gloating. Wow, pretty intense. The roots of his church state animosity stem from several police arrests and subsequent lawsuits local officials filed against Christchurch parishioners, including Wilson's son and his grandson, the latter now a student at New York's Columbia University. Well, that's impressive. That's Ivy League, baby. For a maskless public pray-in during the pandemic and a few stickers protesting coronavirus restrictions affixed to a town lamppost. That's Stickergate for anybody who was not in the know about that. And when I recently spoke with Wilson in his book-lined windowless office just off Main Street, he was still unforgiving. You'd think we'd be a natural constituency for the black and blue, for back the blue. Freudian slip. But after what we have experienced, I think that if any of my parishioners are on the jury, I'd tell them to go in with an open mind, he asserted without hesitation. And he added pointedly, if a Moscow cop were to testify against Koberger, his parishioners would have reason to be skeptical. After all, we know that their officers have lied on the stand before, referring to the case involving his son and grandson. As all of as if all of this were not enough to keep the prosecution up at night, Wilson did not flinch from making his way to what is now the bottom legal line of the Moscow murders. From what I've read, there are a lot of problems with this case, he said. There are a lot of questions that still need to be answered. He concluded with a firm and indignant blast. I think it's very possible the prosecution has the wrong man. Let's see, how much more do we have here? It's still quite, well, no, it's not that much. I'm going to try to finish up, keep this under an hour. Um, Driving down a steep hill in the late afternoon on a blazing summer's day in Moscow, I passed a sign announcing the university golf course. I stare out the car window toward a perfectly manicured green lawn that appeared to stretch toward the horizon, and my thoughts return to an entry I had read a few days earlier in the police blotter of the Moscow Pullman Daily News. It reported, at 7:11 p.m., a moose was spotted at the University of Idaho golf course. Police were unable to locate it. Now, that I thought, with an amused, if not superior smile, was more like the sort of mystery that one would expect to find in the seemingly ordinary northwestern college town. How about a suspicious moose? But that musing quickly took a back seat to the matter at hand. The road abruptly twisted, and then I followed a precipitous dip into a gully where a half dozen or so ramshackle trailers were scattered. I drove slowly, scanning each one for the number I was searching for, and then I found it. The trailer's windows were dark and the curtains were closed. The small front porch was littered like a junkyard. A broken reddish table chair, an umbrella opened as if for a sudden downpour, an assortment of what I guessed were once end tables used to flank a sofa, and a small pyramid of empty flower pots. Sounds like Sanford and Son. Where's my coffee? Hold on 1 minute, please. My bucket of coffee. Let me guzzle for a second. I'm going to try to power through the end of this. If I can. When I knocked on the door, there was no response, so I rapped more forcefully. But still, the only sound was the echo that traveled through the gully. I returned to my car to wait for the registered sex offender. He was a relative of someone who had a connection to Emma Bailey, and I wanted to believe he'd provide testimony that could clarify Koberger's relationship to all the mysteries that had occurred in Moscow on that night last November. I was hoping he could turn hypotheses into fact. As time passed, my wait grew increasingly unnerving, even creepy. No one approached my car to ask what I was doing there or if I were meeting someone, but I could see lights turn on in a few of the trailers and the flickering of window curtains. I could feel eyes being fixed on me. I turned my car around so that the hood was pointed toward the top of the gully. That way I would be able to make a quick escape if necessary. Fortified by that small reassurance, I continued to wait. But the man never showed, and it grew dark. I lost my nerve. I quickly drove out of the trailer park. Since there wasn't sufficient shoulder to execute a U turn, I followed the unpaved road out of town. I was surrounded by wild land, territory as vacant as when the region's first homesteaders had arrived. In the gloaming, I could make out the low, undulating, dune like hills of the Palouse, and beyond them stretched uncultivated fields, even in the encroaching darkness still vivid with the strong blues and yellows of blankets of wild camas plants. That's when I saw the moose. He was lopping over a distant rolling field, or at least I think I saw it. I'm certain I saw something, and to me, a city boy, it sure looked like a moose. They're pretty impressive. I've seen a bunch of them up in Alaska. Was this the moose the local cops had been unable to locate? Had I succeeded where they'd failed? And I found myself wondering, not for the first time, what else had they missed? What else was out there scurrying off into the deep, what else was out there scurrying off into the deep, protective darkness? So, like I said, that's part four of, or no, that's part five of a five-part series, I think. Let me go back to the beginning. I had misquoted and was saying that it was part four. And I believe that this is all going to be, it's already published, but that it's going to be published in a book. Yeah, that's part five. Sorry, I said part four. I was incorrect. That's the Eyes of a Killer. So, wow. Um, I wanted to touch on the Kiely Rodni case before I wrap it up, and we are getting close to 1 hour. I am just doing everything that I can to keep up with the Squirrel Squad, Squirrels on Fire, and that crew because those people are kicking some butt with this case, with the Kiely Rodni case, and just keeping her name out there, just keeping the case alive. For anybody who's interested in justice for Kiely, the more you say her name online and offline, the better. It's so abundantly clear to me, in my opinion, that these two cases are very similar with the drugs, with law enforcement, with uh, cover up, basically. Um, and it's abundantly clear to me, in my opinion, that something severe happened to Kiely at that party, or on that day, August 6th of 2022. That some type of severe injury, possibly, something severe, using Sammy's word, she wasn't looking at her car that severely. There's so many good brain leaks like that in reviewing all of the tapes. And again, Armchair Detective coined the brain leak phrase, and I just love it. It works. Chris Watts did a lot of brain leaks, and Kay did a lot of brain leaks. Certainly, Sammy pulled a lot of them. And let's see. I said yesterday in my tape, my drop, that I had this wild and crazy theory that was new. I don't know how new it is. It's kind of recycled and it's kind of a conglomerate. I think there's still so many questions rather than answers in the Kiely Rodni case. But I am getting more and more certain that she was gravely injured severely at that party. I'm not at all convinced that that was the night she expired. And I'm actually not 100% convinced that she's expired to this day, although I do have a tendency to believe from what Megan Cole has said that she expired a couple days later. So, um, and then, you know, that's when you also have kidnapping charges. If anyone is to get charged in this case, if there are crimes indeed that were committed, there would be kidnapping, you guys. It gets really complicated really quickly. So, if she was being held, conscious or conscious, that makes for a much more complicated case. And everybody who knew anything. So, if her vehicle and her person were being hidden away in a garage or in the woods or anywhere else in a reefer truck, anybody who knew anything about it would be an accomplice. So there might be a lot of people that could be charged if indeed there were crimes committed against Ms. Kiely Rodni. So I'm going to say peace out, folks. Again, ask you to hit your thumbs up button, share, subscribe, ring your notification bell. Um, I'm hoping that with school getting underway for the children, that I can get underway with a more consistent schedule like I had when I first started my channel almost a year ago, you guys. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your day. I hope you can eat well, get exercise, relax, stay hydrated, get some fresh air and sunshine, be kind to yourself, be kind to others. And I'd like to remind all of us to be forgiving of ourselves and forgiving of others. It's extremely important. You know, holding on to anger is like poisonous, basically. So it doesn't matter what the trespass is, forgiving somebody is something you do for yourself. So keep that in mind and eat your vegetables. Thanks again. I'll see you on the next one. And sending you light and love.